It is a great honor to welcome once again to the show Professor Eric Kaufmann of Birkbeck College, University of London. And we're here to discuss his article for the Free Press. It is titled The Indoctrination of the American Mind. How are you today, Eric? Thank you for joining us once again.
John, great to be here again. I should say one thing is I'm no longer at Birkbeck, and I haven't yet announced where I'm going to be going, which I will be announcing at some point. But that's just to sort of for clarification. Yeah, I'm doing fine. As you say, that piece came out in the Free Press. It was based on work that Zach Goldberg and I did in a survey of 18 to 20-year-old Americans, and I've done a similar survey in Britain as well. And this really was just a way of trying to understand what people who are either in school or just recently left school, what they were taught in terms of critical race and gender theory, and also to understand the impact of hearing those messages on their beliefs. And that's really the point of this, is to say, people say, oh, well, critical race theory is not being taught. Or if it is, it's just a few high-profile examples that happen to leak to Chris Rufo. This was just trying to say, well, we want to put this on a scientific footing. We want to take a random sample of 18 to 20-year-olds attending schools all over the country and just ask how many of them have heard terms associated with critical race and gender theories, such as white privilege, systemic racism, unconscious bias, patriarchy, the idea that you choose your gender, all this sort of stuff, just to get a sort of snapshot of how deeply, how widespread these radical ideas are in American education.
Mm-hmm. Right. Just to mention, I actually got a chance to meet Chris Rufo. He was visiting Hungary, and I happened to be there, and so we met.
Okay.
He gave a speech regarding the same issues that we are going to be talking about.
Right.
So as of this recording, he recently came out with a new book, America's Cultural Revolution. Here we go. So, what do you think as you were leafing through the pages of that one?
Well, it's interesting you asked, because I'm just doing a review of his book and Richard Hanania's new book, In Law and Liberty, which I'm hoping will come out very soon. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating account, really, the book talks about the rise of Black Panther radicalism and also Weather Underground radicalism. Weather Underground is sort of the line to Antifa, and Black Panther militancy is the line to BLM. And that kind of runs through the development of critical race theory, which then gets picked up by, and I've got this book as well by James Lindsay, and talks about Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator Marxist educator, who sort of takes up these revolutionary, culturalized Marxist ideas. So it's now not the class revolution, but it'll be the lumpen proletariat, either developing world anti-colonial movements or Black militancy. That these are really the new revolutionaries, and that this kind of critical pedagogy then becomes established in American graduate schools of education. And so Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed becomes the third most cited social science book. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. Just how widespread, again, these ideas of essentially teaching as activism, and activism towards this new utopian society, really. It's all about resisting the particularly racial, but also gender, sexual power structures. And somehow that is the mission of education now, and then no wonder it's going to seep into the schools, right? If that's what administrators and there's a kind of a prestige hierarchy where things that are happening in the most prestigious education schools and universities and then become looked to for best practice and filter down into other schools, and that kind of helps explain, I guess, the production side of these ideas. And our survey, we're just picking up the effects of that, really.
So you're currently living in the United Kingdom, and I wonder if how different does, I guess, critical race theory, CRT, and critical social justice theory, CSJ, manifest itself in Britain than in America? Well, there's one key difference in the history of Britain and America in that uh, in the UK, there's the history of slavery is not of the same nature. The Britain like banned the slave trade long before America stopped um, doing so, for example.
Yeah, but I think the similarities are much stronger than any differences because essentially this is driven, I mean, in my view, this is ultimately driven by this ideology I call cultural socialism, which says equality of outcome for historically marginalized race, gender, sexual identity groups. That's the goal of the system, alongside protection of those groups from harms, including psychological harms, aka emotional trauma, microaggressions, and so on. So what Jonathan Haidt would call the equality and care harm moral foundations are at the center of this ideology of cultural socialism. Now, once you've downloaded that software into your brain, you'll use whatever material your country's history has. So if it isn't Jim Crow, which Britain doesn't have, it doesn't have that history of segregation. Well, you have a history of slavery. You can use that. You can try and say every institution in the country is built on slavery, and that's more or less the argument of the critical race theorists here in Britain. So that's one sort of set of arguments. You can go after the British Empire as being a colonial project. You can go after, this claim of systemic racism, that you had these immigrants after the war to Britain from the Commonwealth, and they were discriminated against because of systemic racism. So there was plenty of material to work with. In Canada, where I'm from, you go after the indigenous settlement, white settler thing, and there are all these, essentially nothing more than delusions about residential schools somehow being implicated in genocide. I mean, that becomes the national myth that's being propounded. So yeah, I think people will use what they've got in terms of historical material. In terms of the actual penetration rates, so I found in the US about 90% of schools had been exposed to critical race theory, and in Britain it was, I think, in the mid-60s, so it's not as high. However, if we look at 18-year-olds in Britain, they have about 10 points more exposure than 20-year-olds, whereas in the US, it's even across the ages, which sort of suggests that this thing has kind of crested in America at a very high level, but in Britain, it's still rising. So those are some important differences. It's not quite as extreme. The penetration rate is not as extreme yet, but it's still pretty high. I mean, 73% of school kids that we surveyed in Britain had at least some exposure to at least one radical race or gender concept.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, to your point, I do think that you were also born in Canada, and we talked about this in our last conversation. And I think both America, Canada, and the UK, we all have these like Achilles' heel, so to speak, that's perceived by the critical social justice crowd as a place to, I guess, to focus their attacks. Right? In Canada, you have the indigenous history. In the UK, you have colonialism, and the US, you have race and slavery. And of course, in Austria, they are doing that too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because I just don't know as much about, like, in continental Europe. I mean, yes, there is certainly in France and the places that had the empires, there is a certain strain of this, right? Because the left, which has undergone this cultural turn, I mean, the radical revolutionary utopian left has undergone this cultural turn in the 60s, and that's, that has made headway in all Western countries. And so I presume that these movements are underway in all countries, but you can see that there is somewhat more resistance, certainly in the French-speaking world, when they say, oh, that's an Anglo-Saxon import. Mm-hmm. That's quite a powerful argument to bat away woke claims. And so, but of course, there is still a battle going on. There's no question about that. But it just seems to me, it strikes me that this problem is worse in the Anglo world. I mean, Scandinavia has had It's been the gender issue, the radical feminism, which has been probably somewhat more to the fore compared to issues around race, but I think it's all in the mix.
Mhm. Yes, I do read that in Quebec, which is where Francophone Canada resides, the resistance to woke education and woke pedagogy is pretty much profound and noted there, and it has to do with the fact that they've made the connection between that and Anglo domination of their cultural heritage. So there's a good deal.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I would say even there is a sort of a divide and a battle, and my understanding from French Canadian colleagues that I've spoken with is, yes, they have a stronger hand. It is not as developed there. The government, people have taken over a forthright stand against it. So yeah, it's perhaps doesn't have quite the same cultural dominance that it does in the Anglo world, but it's still a conflict. It's still a battle. It's not by any means marginalized.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that James Lindsay book and the Brazilian Marxist educational theorist. To your best understanding, how would you outline his theory of education and how that has manifested itself in the Anglo-West?
Well, yeah, so he was a Marxist, Brazilian Marxist who believed in this sort of the Frankfurt School critical theory. When I say critical theory, this is the capital C critical theory from the interwar Europe, Frankfurt School, and beyond that. But essentially, that argument was a version of Marxism that we could call a kind of cultural version of Marxism. So Marx had this concept of false consciousness that people believe in things like religion or nation, and they've kind of been fooled into believing these things by nefarious capitalists who want to divide and rule or make people passive. So that was already there in Marxism. And what the critical theorists did is they took that false consciousness argument and they sort of expanded it to talk about what Antonio Gramsci, Italian Marxist, would call this notion of hegemony, which is that the ruling capitalist class implant this mind virus in people to make them believe in the system. And in order to deprogram people from that hegemony, you have to undergo a process of kind of cultural re-education. And so their thinking was, well, what we need to do is we have to get at the organs of socialization, and these organic intellectuals, these kind of rebel outsider intellectuals who could really see what was going on, who could get, who were outside the matrix that everybody else was in. It's up to them to get into the institutions of education and essentially to propagandize and not brainwash, but essentially to re-educate the population out of their hegemony. And so that's kind of where Freire is coming from as an educator. So he believes in this transformation of consciousness through education, and that's how you make socialism successful. And so those ideas then come into critical pedagogy in the 1980s when he's corresponding with Henry Giroux and others in the United States. They then build a very successful a movement of academics, and subsequently infiltrate the education schools, set up centers, and promote Freire's ideas about radical pedagogy, which then this is essentially teacher activism, that they're going to somehow break kids out of their structural racism, sexism, support for capitalism. And by getting at the children, you then open up the possibility for a new consciousness and moving to a new form of society.
So I spent a great deal of time studying the works of Herbert Marcuse, which is America's leading critical theorist of the 50s, 60s, and such. And he has this idea called the Great Refusal, which he believes that in order to free yourself, you shouldn't conform to any of the I guess, the bourgeois model of living and being and educating and such. Um, Nevertheless, what the critical theorists I find missing is that if you impose a new hegemony, then you impose a new form of domination rather than, freeing yourself from everything, right?
Well, that's right, but they somehow believe that their system is superior. The socialist consciousness somehow it's this utopian idea that from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, we herd sheep in the morning, write poetry in the afternoon, all these kind of ideas from uh, Marx, these kind of utopian ideas, but and somehow a world without any racism or sexism or homophobia or anything will be created, and we'll all be holding hands under the rainbow. I mean, so there is that kind of I suppose there's that kind of view that, well, yes, they will be installing a new hegemony, but it'll be the right one. And, I mean, I guess if I had to say, and of course their thinking is so utopian. I mean, they because they haven't actually had to manage or run anything, they can more or less focus on destroying the existing system without having to give too much thought to how the new system will work. I mean, this is sort of what happened with communism. I mean, you had all the effort was made on overthrowing capitalism, and yes, there was a blueprint for the workers' state and so on, but once the results of that system came in, it was largely a work of more or less memory holding disasters and famines and genocides and papering over all the problems in the system. And I think, and in a way, Rufo makes that point that the outcome of the sort of more anarchist socialism that this new left is all, this is really what the new left is about, is this sort of cultural but also more anarchist form of anti-authoritarian socialism, and it has always resulted in a disaster whenever it's been tried. Of course, it's only been tried on a small scale, like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, where there was this lawless zone, and pretty soon you start getting beatings and murders and all kinds of things. And then we know that from Steven Pinker's work on the better angels of our nature, that essentially when you get anarchy, you get extreme violence and high death rates. And even authoritarianism is preferable to anarchy in terms of death rates. I mean, by a factor of 10, So, yeah, I mean, this is clearly completely impractical and destructive utopianism, but they give very little thought to this sort of deliberate workings, rational deliberation and actual implementation of the new system, and a lot in all their energy is basically focused on tearing down the existing order, which they believe is somehow unjust.
Yeah, that's where I think the Hobbesian state of nature comes in, and you can find that there's like a small sliver of Hobbes that can be applied to conservative thinking. That is, if in a revolution often results in that state of nature, and if you do want to implement a successful revolution, so to speak, example would be the American one. You kind of have statesmen involved in it, like people who know how to build a new system, whether it's much inspired by the old, like American with the British common law, or the French eventually.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is partly where that more Burkean evolution rather than revolution type of idea. Now, of course, sometimes you do need revolution, but yeah, always trying to sort of be constructive and to think through how the new system will work. And you're right, the founders had given a lot of thought to, how the new system will work, checks and balances and federalism and so on. And whereas this is pretty much just a highly utopian and impractical kind of revolutionary program. And so, yeah, I think that's quite different. Sorry, what was the other part of your question? I forget.
No, that's just a remark, but
Yeah.
but I like to move on to the question of your article, and I wonder how are some of these ideas, CRT and CSJ, being taught to students? How would how would say a given CRT educator bring these ideas, which can be very abstract, to preschoolers, kindergartners, and you know.
Yeah, so what you have is a kind of stripped down, vulgarized version of critical race theory. Critical race theory is the idea that you can have racism without racists. So it's like you're floating in a matrix,
Mhm.
and no one thinks they're doing anything racist, but somehow we've inherited these structures like being on time or passing a standardized test, with somehow are embodying these nefarious structural racism principles, and somehow people are have unconsciously inherited stereotypes going back to the slave times, and even though they don't know it, it's unconsciously operating in their brains, so they feel that they should have an advantage over somebody else. So this kind of that's sort of the high critical race theory. Now, what happens when it filters down into schools? It sort of becomes, served up in bite-sized form, sort of like shredded wheat, or shreddies. So you have terms: white privilege, stand in a line and let's do a progressive stack or a privilege walk. For example, if you are white, take a pace. If you are male, take another step forward. That is sort of the vulgarization then, and application of this really quite abstract structural racism argument in critical race theory, right? So it's trying to turn it into something tangible. Of course, critical race theory would also argue that race is socially constructed, but when it comes to the classroom, when it comes to any concrete application, race gets very real very quickly. So it's, oh, you're white, you stand over there. Right? You're a person of color, you stand over there. Suddenly, this thing isn't so constructed anymore. It's very actual. It's very personal. That is sort of how it's put into practice. Terms like white privilege, systemic racism, white supremacy, whiteness. These are sort of the ways in which these terms filter into schools. And on the gender side, patriarchy would be an example of that, or the idea of many genders, gender being a choice. That is sort of the way this is explained to kids. You have books that are, they may be picture books that try to sort of make similar points. And of course, you have just the teaching of history and society in an extremely decontextualized and skewed way. So talk about slavery, focusing on the sins of the United States, for example, but not talking about slavery in non-Western societies, in the Arab world, or even of the Spanish or Portuguese empires. Not to mention the slavery that was going on in Africa, that was sort of, really, it was African kingdoms that were fighting each other, taking slaves, selling them on to the Europeans. But none of that context comes in. It's turned into a very black and white morality play of, white people taking slaves by force to the United States. This is what slavery is all about, the sum total. And likewise on the sort of imperialism, colonialism, white settlement front, there's no mention of the ferocious battles between the Iroquois and the Huron and the Comanche and the Apache, or any of these, which were much more lethal, much more brutal in many ways, or the slavery on the West Coast Salish Indians had, that was actually stopped by the British 1851. Again, nobody knows anything about that. I saw a survey, 60% of Americans agree with the statement that Native people lived in peace and harmony before the Europeans arrived. That kind of belief system is nurtured by this education, because it simply doesn't place things in world historical context, and it simply focuses narrowly and in a sort of narrow and biased way on certain narratives. The narrative of white oppression of non-white is essentially key to its outlook, and also the narrative of oppression, male versus female and heterosexual versus homosexual. So this is sort of the way in which a sort of dumbed down version of these academic theories is presented to young people with the hope of kind of indoctrinating them in cultural socialism.
Yes, on the gender front, I distinctively remember that only 10 years ago, the arguments that were popular amongst feminist circles were, the patriarchy, the wage gap, and so on and so on. But within that frame of reference, the implicit agreement is that there are two genders, male and female, and the category of female should be kept because it's not just a gender; it's also a political class. But nowadays, there's a conflict brewing between women who are native women, biological women, and trans women or biological males who transition into femalehood. So there's a fracturing of coalitions there. But one thing that always puzzles me is that why is so much political capital being spent in the realm of the woke CSJ crowd to, I guess, to appeal to or appease a very small number of people who identify themselves as LGBTQ plus?
Well, because I think it's not actually about that small number of people. Actually, it is about the progressive bicycle that if you don't keep pedaling, you're going to fall off in a way. And so the latest innovation, the newest level that this ideology, which is really cultural socialism based on equal outcomes plus acute sensitivity to any emotional harms that are being done, right? That's the ideology. Where they've taken it is to the trans place. They've gone from homosexuality to trans. That's their sort of new frontier. For them to actually acknowledge failure, for them to actually say, you know what, we made a mistake in going into this gender thing, and we have to actually back away, and we failed, would be to admit that this whole messianic narrative of being on the right side of history, of being the vanguard, people who see further than everybody else and are leading society towards utopia, that somehow they've made a wrong turn. And that would be unthinkable. And so there was a huge amount invested by the cultural socialist left in the trans cause. So they can't give it up. So, and of course, so this is not about the 0.02% of the population that's trans. It's a symbolic cipher for a much larger ideological struggle, which is the sort of cultural socialist agenda. And that's one of the reasons why it's very hard to be a member in good standing of this progressive vanguard if you are not on side with the trans issue. And so that is why you'll have many female progressives who are very much on the trans side. Now, it's worth saying that, I mean, if you look at feminism, there have always been kind of two types of feminism. One, a more androgynous feminism seeking to make women like men. And that links to the second wave of feminism, which was really about women entering into male professions and so on. And that, so there is a kind of gradation, but this idea of gender being a social construct and gender roles being, if we gave girls trucks to play with and boys dolls to play with, then they'd like that. That kind of very blank slate view of the world is part of feminism, and that sort of bleeds into trans feminism. But then you have the other difference feminism, which is really about this idea that, for female virtues are superior in women, and the role of mothers, the role of carers, have a different, higher sensibility, and that has to be nurtured. Society has to be moved, become more like us. Well, that idea of the specialness of women and women's spaces and all of that is a different, and arguably is in tension with the more androgynous feminism. And so that is kind of, I mean, if we take gender critical feminists, they are very much of that difference feminist school, whereas the trans activists are more on that kind of androgynous school. And yeah, I mean, these splits are coming apart. It doesn't really make any sense that they should be in the same camp. But what I would say is, because they have a common enemy in the bad old, white supremacist patriarchy, that could paper over the differences for a while until we get to some of the new debates over women's spaces and so on.
I think there is a conflict between the mind of the critical social justice follower, in that you're committed to a kind of bourgeois form of bohemianism, bobo, as David Brooks put it some years ago in 2000, I think, where you would like to escape from this bourgeois way of thinking about gender norms and capital relations and etc. Well, yes, but at the same time, they are also committed to a certain strain of, I guess, Puritanism, in that they are highly critical of those who do not agree with them. So it's a very tough thing to to reconcile, but nevertheless they've managed to do so, at least publicly, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Puritanism comes from the religious quality of cultural socialism. So you've got cultural socialism, which, as I said, is about equal results for identity groups plus psychological harm protection, emotional safety for identity groups. That's the ideology. But around that is this religious project as well, or let's just say this religious canopy attached to the ideology, which says that historically disadvantaged race, gender, and sexual identity groups are more spiritual, have deeper insights, and therefore need to be elevated above those who have fewer oppression points. So more spiritual, more moral, deeper insights, and therefore are sacred in a way. So if you are further down the totem pole of oppression points and you disagree with, or much less insult, or even appear to be insulting someone higher up the totem pole, then that's blasphemy. It's not just you're wrong, but it's like you transgressed the sacred. So even something like, if somebody says, I have a program called anti-racism or anti-sexism, if I say, well, I oppose that because that's going to result in, because your program is going to result in a loss of my speech rights and discrimination against me, you then become a racist and you've transgressed. So affirmative action, if you're opposed to that, that's in the name of helping a sacred group, and you're opposing that, you're violating a sacred value. And so it's this violation of the sacred that brings forth the religious response. They're a witch. It's not a rational response. It's like you violated a sacred value. And it's because of that religious quality that we get the witch hunts, the cancelings, and the sort of radioactivity around the dissenter, and which is something that emerges, I think, from this sort of spiritual religious element to the ideology.
Mm-hmm. And I think the creed, so to speak, it's not even that consistent. You mentioned affirmative action, and what I read is that after the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke case, the rationale for the affirmative action was changed from, reparation to a historically disadvantaged group to promoting diversity in university campuses. Something in the lines of a farm boy somewhere can bring something that a city kid from Boston cannot provide, and that was extended to a whole host of other things too. So even if there is a creed, it changes all the time, and it can be very confusing if you are like if you're a believer, much less a non-believer like you and I, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this though is tactical. It's the same wine in a new bottle, or it's the same ship, but it's traveling under a different flag. And so it's still about equal results for different racial groups. So University of California, Berkeley wants to have X% Black and Hispanic. If the court says you can't use the reparations rationale anymore, but we'll let you use the diversity rationale, then you use the diversity rationale. Diversity still essential. It doesn't really mean diversity in its full spectrum. It really means X% Black and X% Hispanic. That's all it means. It's still equal outcomes for historically marginalized groups. So I would say it's the same belief system. It's just that the label on the tin changes. And of course, this is what Rufo points out, really, is that this movement is quite adept at using euphemisms to conceal its cultural socialism. So it will try and sort of talk about inclusion, equity, diversity. But once you unpack those labels, you see it's the same old. I kind of use this term, well, it's basically an iron fist and a velvet glove, right? So it's speech suppression and racial and gender discrimination trafficking under the label of inclusion, diversity, and equity. But one shouldn't be fooled by whatever label they're using.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned earlier in this discussion that a good percentage of students in the US and the UK were, exposed to these ideas, whether at school or outside of school. But I wonder how receptive are they? For example, 100% of school children are exposed to math. There are not that many mathematicians out there, so I wonder if it is analogous.
Well, this is the big question. I mean, is how deeply this indoctrination has sunk. I think on the one hand, if you look at attitude surveys, these would suggest that the indoctrination has worked quite well. Like in Britain, if you take 18 to 25-year-olds, as many of them think J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publisher as who oppose J.K. Rowling being dropped by her publisher. 2/3 of American and British 18 to 25s in surveys I've done agree with Google's firing of James Damore for using data and evidence to question the firm's gender policy. Really pretty strong data and evidence. So that kind of gives you a sense that, and some of the surveys coming out of the universities, 75% of US undergraduates surveyed saying that if a professor says something that offends the students, they should be reported to the administration. Sort of 65 to 85% saying that a speaker who says BLM is a hate group or who says abortion should be banned should not be permitted on campus to speak. So we actually have quite a bit of data showing quite a lot of moral absolutism and intolerance amongst Gen Z and some of the millennial generation. And so I do think it's had an impact. And now, of course, some of that's coming from social media, from influencers, from celebrities, and so on. It's not, and that's probably the larger influence, but together, the institutions plus the youth culture are combining, I think, to create this heightened sensitivity around race, gender, and sexuality. Now, does that mean everyone is being influenced? No. I mean, it's quite clear also that there's a big gender divide amongst young people, and younger men in particular are much less likely to subscribe to this belief system than young women. Those who are identifying as LGBT, which is in some of these surveys suggesting as much as 25% of this age group on surveys. That's an overestimate, I believe, because for various reasons, but still, those who are not LGBT are clearly not as likely to be buying into these concepts as those who identify as LGBT. So there are these different fault lines within the young population. The gender gap is the one that's really striking, by the way. That really does seem to be very big. And I'm not sure, it could be that the gender gap is wider amongst elite young people from the most privileged backgrounds, most privileged schools, there's some evidence to that, to suggest that. I'm not sure what the truth is there, but and there's no question that that they are much further to the left culturally than older generations.
Mhm. I think both you and I, and also Chris Rufo, I think share this hope that there are two blocks of, I guess, people in college campuses and beyond who can be persuaded. Well, there are people who are against these woke social justice ideology in the get-go. They find it to be wrong, and they find the appeal of people like yourself and Chris and James Lindsay, and also the neutrals, those who do not care very much about these ideologies, but they find that within the institutional framework, as well as the very vocal true believers of this ideology, they have this Puritan view of intimidation and disincentives to question it or to say otherwise. And our hopes is that these numbers may be larger than we think, perhaps even larger than the ideologue, so to speak. So I wonder, to what extent are these groups prevented from, I guess, from speaking up or even questioning this doctrine?
Well, you're right. So I think there's two elements there. I mean, one is how much are people attracted to the doctrine versus how much are they fearful of running afoul of the doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I agree with you in the sense that if you look at young people, their rates of voting are lower, at least and certainly in Britain. And I have to check the numbers, I think also in the US. So you could say they're more individualistic, more detached from politics than previous generations, which would suggest that these beliefs are lightly held by a lot of them. There's a lot of independence rather than strong partisans. But so that's one data point. I think that's right. I guess the question is how persuadable they will be going forward. I mean, there is a connection between, and there's also a connection between attraction to an ideology, your own personal sense of what morality is, and your fear of being shamed. So the guilt and the shame are arguably connected, because there was a psychologist called George Herbert Mead in the 1930s who had this idea that our morality is really about a kind of internal audience in our brains looking down on us, and we're trying to not shame ourselves in front of that internal audience, whereas the fear and what Timur Kuran would call preference falsification is our fear of being shamed publicly. There is a relationship between those two. The other thing is that I think Robert Trivers had this idea that what is rational for us in self-interested terms, so obeying woke dictates, can become something we convince ourselves of as being morally right. And so there's also a path from naked self-interest to actual moral belief. So I think in both cases, that would suggest that actually this has a good chance of bedding down amongst a significant share of these people. And I think there is good evidence for that as well in the survey data. So I'm a bit more pessimistic. I actually think Millennial and Gen Z, particularly with women, there's a lot of true belief. There isn't really an alternative morality that they've been given, with the exception of the online sort of people who are online anti-woke, getting the Jordan Petersons and Andrew Tates and Joe Rogans and so on, which is a large group, particularly amongst younger men. But with the exception of that, we don't really have an alternative belief system to that equality, care, harm moral foundation, which is really what cultural socialism is all about. So communal obligation to country, religion, all of that has faded quite a lot. And so it's not clear there is an alternative moral value system. And certainly in terms of public morality, the big taboos and stigmas are all around the identity categories. And so, yeah, I think we're in a bit of a hole with the younger generation, and it's going to require, Rufo and Hanania both kind of talk about the importance of ultimately reconfiguring the education system if we're going to actually save generations coming in behind. I mean, that's really the hope, is not Gen Z millennials, particularly women, to some extent, not a lost cause, not totally a lost cause, but you've got to get at the generations coming in behind them, really, to have a hope of turning the ship around.
I think my slight criticism with Rufus's approach is that he's practically doing the same thing as the critical social justice scholars doing, which is changing the educational system from the top down, which, while it is well, my idea is that it is better and more secure if we do it from the bottom up. Like the students are opposed to this idea and they enact a form of social change. It's a form of like old school democratic participation. But nevertheless, this is what I'm very much concerned about, is that within the younger college educated generation, such as myself, I guess the extent of political participation is either you are extremely active and you care, and you have these like 2 or 3 issues that you really care about, and you spend all of the time in the world just focusing on them. You form your student activist charter and you join every other march for peace, for Palestine, and etc. And you have another, on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who do not care about the political process. They are completely disillusioned. They believe that it is just the same people with the same ideas. The age of people in the Senate do not really encourage them all that much, for example. So what I find is that there needs to be like a healthy level of political engagement amongst young people. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether that can be achieved.
Well, even though you're right that people aren't just passive receptacles and blank slates for whatever is pushed at them in school or in their institutions, I think that's correct. Although our study did show a significant impact of the amount of CSJ exposure, at least in the US case, really did predict partisanship, predicted belief about white guilt and reparations quite significantly. So I think it's having a big effect. I guess my argument would be that even though blank slate is not, strictly speaking, 100% correct, there's some truth in it, and there is a degree to which young people are socialized by institutions. Now, of course, they can resist. Of course, they can get alternative messages online, and they do. I think this is more true for younger men, and that is so that I think that the culture war, the battle of ideas, has to continue to be fought out in podcasts and magazines and newspapers. And yes, absolutely, that's a very important task, but I think it's the task of generations. And for that to sort of trickle down to celebrity culture, to youth culture, the young people are being influenced by a lot of the most progressive institutions, whether that be schools, whether that be universities, whether that be celebrities, large corporations, right? So that's really the crucible in which they're being socialized. So I think it is important to try and take control of the mechanisms of socialization, to try and give yourself a fighting chance. It's not because we want to indoctrinate people a different way. It's about trying to sort of reach, in my view, this is perhaps where I disagree with Rufo, is with Rufo and some of the post-liberals want to institute, public religion and teach our version of dogma. My own view is actually what we want to be doing is aiming to have balance and neutrality in public institutions, with a veneer, yes, of there has to be loyalty to, I think, the nation and a common purpose, but I think a light version of that. But basically what has to happen, I think, is you can aim at neutrality and balance. So what that will mean is, indoctrination in schools needs to be outlawed. I mean, in Britain, there's a law against it. It needs to be enforced properly. The meaning of indoctrination needs to be specified in very fine detail by legal guidance issued by equality bodies, for example. Racism, harassment, all these terms need to be defined in detail. So critical race theory has to be sort of specified as political and partisan. The term white privilege, systemic racism, all of that needs to be defined in law and can be defined in law and legal guidance as partisan indoctrination. And what you need to do is sort of turn the ratchet, squeeze all of the indoctrination out of the schools, out of the institutions, out of the civil service. And you can do that. So my aim is really to say we can achieve something that looks like neutrality and balance, whereas a lot of people would say, oh, balance is impossible. Rufo would say neutrality is impossible. I think you can approach it asymptotically. I think you can reach it. I don't necessarily think you have to replace their dogma with our dogma. Now, I do think it makes sense in a nation state where you want people to pay taxes and you want people to participate in the democracy. You need to have at least some sense of the civic national project. So yes, I wouldn't just want to have a trashing of your nation and its history. But I think there are ways to do it that are more, where you can have certainly criticism of the nation where it fell short of its ideals, but it has to be wrapped up in a sort of positive self-conception. And what that means is essentially, what that essentially means is you've got to put any sins of the country in world historical perspective. Yeah, genocide, discrimination, slavery, all of these things are human universals. We did it too, but we overcame it. I mean, that's the message that I would support. Yes, stole the land from the natives. They stole the land from each other. That's human history. Nothing new here. This is not exceptional. That's the kind of way I would like to see these things taught. This idea of natives as this living in harmony with nature and each other, come on, that's got to be unmasked. We have to look much more honestly at non-European history. And I think that'll just help to contextualize and take the edge, take some of the steam out of the woke balloon when it comes to this very one-sided, narrow view of the national past. And it's all about rebalancing. So I guess I'm a believer in the possibility of rebalancing and eventually getting to a kind of bipartisan consensus, right? And that might be a difference where compared to those who say, no, we have to achieve outright victory and impose public religion. No, I'm not a fan of that approach. But I can certainly understand the view that because the other side is so completely one, the view comes to be, pushing universalism. They're going to subvert it all the way down, and they're just going to subvert. And I accept that may be a problem, but I still think that if you have a well enough defined sense of what is political and what is neutral, I think you can go after. If you have administrators who are pushing DEI ideology, you can put a stop to that. You can fire people. You can abolish departments. Yeah, go to war with those who are trying to politicize the institutions. But I still think your end goal should be some concept of neutrality.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I'm also very worried that some of these ideas are doing to the social sphere, especially amongst, again, college-educated young like myself. For example, if someone identifies as LGBTQ, it's very easy to assume firsthand what their political views are and what they think of people who disagree with them, and therefore the chances of two people of opposing views getting along or even dating, for example, are getting slimmer, and we are seeing a dearth of people going out and being intimate with one another. So I wonder if there's a correlation between the two.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of these numbers are pretty astounding. So in the FIRE surveys, which cover, I think, 40,000 undergrads at the top 150 R1 universities in America, you can see that of the young people who, of these students who didn't vote for Trump or who don't support Trump, which is the vast majority, Only 7% of women and 19% of men would date a Trump supporter. So you have massive discrimination on the dating front, political discrimination on the. Now you could say, well, people have the right to date who they want. It's a free country, and that's true. So it's clearly you can't. People have freedom of association rights, but I think there's a difference between saying like I prefer to date people who share my political views, and the statement I would not date someone of another view. I think there's quite a distinction there. The first is much more acceptable, I think, than the other. And the second problem, of course, is that, and it's the same here in Britain, by the way, there's a big asymmetry between people who are willing to date a Remain supporter, remaining in the European Union versus leaving the European Union amongst young people. The other thing we find consistently is that people who say they wouldn't date a Trump supporter are much more likely to say they wouldn't hire a Republican for a job. So this discrimination, which is not illegal in terms of dating, but is illegal in many jurisdictions in terms of hiring or promotion or refereeing a paper, what you get is this increasing intolerance on the dating front, political intolerance bleeding over into intolerance in terms of hiring and equal treatment. In academia, for example, in the US, 40% of American academics I polled would not hire a known Trump supporter for a job. In Britain, a third wouldn't hire a known Brexit supporter. And this, of course, Brexit, 52% of the population voted for it. They wouldn't hire a known supporter of this majority position for a job. That's pretty staggering, a pretty staggering level of political prejudice. Not only that, there's a correlation between having politically prejudiced attitudes and supporting things like shouting down speakers, firing people who have controversial views. So the sort of support for institutional sanctions and authoritarianism is correlated with political bias and prejudice. And so, yeah, we're getting this cluster of left-wing political bias in particular. I mean, there is right-wing political bias as well, but it's not as extreme. And the other thing is in many organizations, white-collar organizations, there is a progressive majority. So the impact, like in academia, if you take social sciences where it might be 10 on the left for every 1 on the right, the prejudice of the 1 against the 10 doesn't really matter because the 10 are going to be prejudiced in favor of their candidate. So what you get is the impact of discrimination hitting very heavily on dissenters, such as conservatives or gender critical feminists. So between the asymmetric left being more prejudiced against the right than vice versa, plus their numerical advantage in these institutions, you're creating extremely hostile climate for any diversity of thought. And I think that's kind of behind a lot of the problems that we have. And ultimately, if you kind of dig down into the predictors of this unwillingness to date or hire, it gets back to this view, they're racist or sexist or transphobes, so there is the identity stuff is sitting underneath the intolerance, which is sitting underneath the political discrimination, right? So, and so I could bore you with various kinds of correlations, but yeah, people of a very morally absolutist view tend to think all white Republicans are racist, tend to therefore not want to date a Republican because they're somehow violators of sacred values. They've defiled the pure. There's this almost disgust reaction against the impure, right? So it's that emotive sort of substrate that I think sits behind the kind of growing polarization and nastiness and bias that's emerging.
So a concluding question. I think for conservatives, you and I included, the task is not to come up with new ideas to advance society or whatnot, is to find new ways to espouse old ideas or to make old ideas like new, so to speak. Harkening back to that Ronald Reagan quote, right? Freedom is only a generation away from extinction. That means every generation we have to find new arguments for, say, liberty, for example. And I think this is where I can be more sympathetic to the post-liberals in that they as much as they dislike liberalism, they're doing their utmost to inspire people to follow religious traditions and the like. And I think this is where a I suppose a coalition of liberals and traditionalists can unite on this front, in that we need to bring back these ideas. We need to make new arguments for them. So how do you propose to do that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. First of all, you're right on two fronts. I mean, one is we need a coalition of liberals, by which I mean classical liberals who believe in the Enlightenment, objective truth, free speech, equal treatment, due process, and conservatives who believe in nation, perhaps in religion, but that family existing gender, the gender binary, for example, or the sex binary. Yeah, and I think that's the new coalition that's coming together, whereas the old coalition very much had the left and liberals on the same side. I think now liberals are moving to the right because of progressive illiberalism. So that's the first thing. Now, I think the key task is more around the heart than the mind, as I think you say. So in order to mobilize, in order to improve, to increase support for the conservative or classical liberal position, there has to be a winning of hearts. The left has had a kind of hammerlock because of the attractiveness of its narrative of the virtuous oppressed minority versus the oppressor majority, and that I'm on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor. Therefore, I'm on the side of the minorities against the majority. That is their framework, which is developed really through the 20th century, partly, of course, as a result of success in rolling back very real discrimination on the basis of race and sex and sexuality, which really did pit majorities against minorities. And so as a result of those sort of more classically liberal victories for equal treatment, what builds up is this narrative of bad majority, particularly bad white male majority, against virtuous minority. I'm on the side of the virtuous minority. And so the hero ideal is that of the white savior figure, the white protector figure, the you're from the dominant group, but you're actually an ally of the minority group. And that's kind of the ego ideal that a lot of young, particularly young educated people, that's what they want to inhabit. And then, of course, it gets layered on with revolutionary imagery, romantic imagery, right, around the various individuals who exemplify this. And many of our movies, I mean, that kind of a character, I'm just trying to, it may be, typically it's sort of the white ally with the black sidekick, the Mel Gibson, Danny Glover, whatever it happens to be. So there is this kind of theme in a lot of movies of the virtuous, the good white ally. And that's the kind of ego ideal. And to some degree, I think that the job of conservatives is to provide an alternative to that very simple one-dimensional picture, to provide other kinds of ego ideals. Maybe it's people who are honoring the memory of ancestors or political ancestors, carrying on the work of a tradition, upholding recognizing the hard work, the sacrifices of our forebears, whether they be spiritual, political, or genealogical, or being a good member of a community, or so these sorts of more conservative imagos and ego ideals are going to have to become more prominent. And of course, that tends to happen through literature, through film, through music, and of course, those are fields dominated by the left. And so the trick is going to be, how do you actually win on the meaning-making, myth, symbol, narrative front to try and change the kind of emotional orientation of people? Because I think really what wokeism and cultural socialism is about, it's not actually a systematizing ideology. It's very much about, here were a bunch of street level movements and protests and the energy from that. And it's the sort of emotional energy of those street level movements and protests galvanized into a set of very inchoate moral intuitions around equal outcomes and care harm for the disadvantaged, crystallizing into this very sort of leaderless, emotional kind of blob. And that's kind of really what the cultural socialism of the new left is all about. But it's been very appealing because it's sort of been floated along by these ego ideals of the defender of the downtrodden, and also by a set of social taboos, really, which have grown up, again, quite irrational taboos. I mean, they make sense in some ways. Obviously, you don't want to have people, there should be a social penalty for racism and sexism and so on, but the sort of sacralizing of that and the expansion of that to include all kinds of things. These taboos, we're also going to have to address those. We're going to have to make these more, there are going to have to be other taboos against defiling your country, the memory of those who sacrificed for you. I mean, those kinds of taboos are going to have to become stronger so that they can cross-cut. And also these taboos have to be in some ways deconstructed to some degree. I mean, you still want to have somebody's a repeat offender and do, and are really awful racists. They should be obviously shunned, but there has to be a sliding scale. It can't be just instant social death. I think there's all this cultural work that needs to be done in order to rebalance our moral order.
Well, on that wonderful note, thank you very much, Professor Eric Kaufmann, for joining this program.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much.